That's why we have
Okay.
chromosomes XX versus XY. And these affect it affects every system of the body as well. So when we're talking about women are not small men, it's not just the hormonal aspects, it's the actual sex differences within muscle, within heart, within fueling, everything that stems from birth.
So let's take a track back, and let's separate this, the biggest differences, and let's separate it in terms of, let's start first of all with exercise and state what the differences are and what women should be really focusing on.
When we look at like resistance training, and everyone's like, oh, well, if you lift weights, you'll get all bulky, and we shouldn't be lifting heavy. And we know that that's a misnomer because women do better with power training with regards to building strength and building lean mass. And the only way you can really get bulky is you work really, really hard at it. Like you have to eat a lot, you have to not do any cardio, and you really have to focus on heavy lifting, and that's all you're doing. So, if we're talking about the general woman who's trying to get strong and get lean and get healthy, resistance training is one of the key factors because we need to maintain muscle mass. And it tends to get pushed to the wayside. We see a lot of things where they're incorporating resistance training, body weight stuff, and high reps. And this is all the idea of, quote, building lean mass, but it's not. It's all a cardiovascular aspect. And you'll see a little bit of a token to resistance training on the back end of a cardiovascular class or a boot camp class. But there isn't that real drive and focus in the general pop for resistance training. And it's so important because it's been downplayed so much for women because of this misnomer that women will get bulky, that it's more of a male thing and you need testosterone, and that women should be doing light weights and body weight stuff. And it's a disservice because it doesn't really build the strength and lean mass that we need for quality of life from when we're in our 20s all the way up to when we're getting into our 90s. Plus all the things, of course, that you've talked about with regards to resistance training and brain health. So when we're talking about exercise, we don't really know what the actual protocol should be for women to optimize resistance training. We just fall into a typical periodization program that's been based on male data. So is it appropriate to do a typical periodization program? Maybe, maybe not, because we're seeing information coming out that if you are periodizing around your menstrual cycle and working with your hormones, that you can get better outcomes than if you were to do a typical 3 or 4 times a week and then having a deload every 6 weeks or something to that effect. So there are lots of things within the actual protocols that still need to be answered. And I look and I'm like, oh, it's 2022 and we still don't know.
Why is it that we still don't know?
There's a cultural, and I guess it started as a cultural context where women were always deemed too delicate to participate in sport, and they have menstrual cycles, so and they shouldn't be doing anything during the week of their period. And it kind of fed forward to a lot of the scientific research where it was just a male lens for design of research projects and research design. And we have a small amount of money. We have to have people come in, get it done, get them in and out quickly, get the results. And when they start saying, well, we need to include women, then you have the pushback, oh, women have a menstrual cycle and it's really hard for timing of menstrual cycle and we have this short amount of time. Or we have a really difficult time recruiting women to participate. And it's like, well, actually it's not difficult recruitment. It's the language that you're using because there's been this cultural backlash that women should not be included in research studies, most biomedical studies. I mean, even now there are reviews coming out saying that there is a lack of representation of women in medical studies. And, and again, it's 2022. So it's that historical context of research design. And I always flip it and say, if the norm was to include women and to include the menstrual cycle and hormone perturbations, and that was just standard, then there wouldn't be this exclusionary aspect of women in participation because it would just be the norm. You would just say, okay, here's the study, this is the time frame, this is where we need women in follicular phase, this is where we need them in their luteal phase, let's match it up, and that would just be the norm. But because we're trying to overlay it onto a typical male lens of we have 4 weeks to get a study done, we have to have a test, retest, retest, and women don't fit into that model. And then when you say, well, we have to accommodate for menstrual cycle, and it lengthens out that time frame for data collection, they put it in the too hard basket. So it's my push now to really get people to say, no, this is the norm and this is how you design a study, and that is the norm. Men can fit into that study too, but this is the norm. So there's been some good methodology papers that have come out in the past couple of years describing that as well. Now the push is to get people to do it.
Well, I was going to actually ask if these are randomized control trials that you're advocating for. Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're the gold standard, and
Yeah.
that's because we can't really go off systematic reviews anymore. We can't really
No,
go off.
not at
Yeah,
all.
we've really got to nail it with these randomized control trials.
Yeah, because the issue with systematic reviews, and we see this in some of the stuff that's come out saying that there's no difference between menstrual cycle phase, is it washes out, and it also washes out proper methodology. So when you look at some of the earlier studies, they didn't accommodate for luteal phase versus follicular phase. It was just studied in the follicular phase. Also, there is a lot of misstep in where are you testing women? Are you testing them early follicular, mid follicular? And so all of that gets washed out in a systematic review, and everything gets pushed into this norm. And of course, any differences are going to be washed out. So again, that's why we need RCTs, so that you can actually look at where a woman is, where the hormones are, what is the individual variation. So you're testing apples to apples instead of apples to bananas to oranges.
Yeah. So let's talk about, like, why do you advocate so much for strength and resistance training? So, I know the audience has heard a lot about resistance training and brain health, but apart from that, what are some of the reasons to maintain or optimize skeletal muscle for women?
From a health standpoint, if we look, it is a metabolically active tissue. So, of course, it increases and maintains a really good resting metabolic rate. It is instrumental in blood glucose control and insulin sensitivity. It is instrumental in maintaining posture and balance. So as we're starting to get older, we see that there is actually an RCT that came out looking at women who are 80 years and plus, and they were doing typical, 3 times a week, 10 to 12 reps versus power training, being like heavier and lower reps. And then the women who were doing the heavier and lower reps at 80 plus put on lean mass, but also have better balance control. So if you're walking and you accidentally step off a curb, you don't have the risk of falling and breaking your hip. So it's those things when we look for the eye to health. It's resistance training across the board, helps with metabolic control, so prevention of diabetes, cardiovascular disease. We look at maintains bone density. It helps with body composition. It helps maintain thyroid. It's just all of these things when you have lean mass and you're overturning that lean mass and developing the strength. And it's not to say cardiovascular work is not important, because we know that you want to do some high intensity work that helps with other metabolic control and other factors. But the biggest drop for most women is really putting that emphasis on building lean mass, so that they have it not only for whatever their performance is, because you need to be strong to be successful in whatever your sport is, from rock climbing all the way up to sumo wrestling. But you also have to have the idea of where am I going to be when I'm 70 or 80. I want to be independent and free, and I want to be able to carry my own groceries. I want to play with my grandkids. I want to be able to go for a walk and not have pain or worry about falling. And if you're doing resistance training along the way, it just kind of becomes a moot point of that worry when you're older, because it's there.
Yeah. And that's something that I keep telling my mother. I'm like, get to the gym. So I was in Australia. I bought her 10 personal training sessions, and I actually paid for them. So then she's got no way of getting out of it.
Nice.
So I actually just recently put up a post around vitamin D deficiency and miscarriages. And I want to know if you've come across any data surrounding fertility or reproductive health and skeletal muscle. If you come around anything like that, I think that would be a really interesting study to do.
Yeah, I haven't, but We know that there is quite a link between low energy availability and fertility issues. And so, what I mean by that is women who are in a breakdown state all the time, that catabolic state, so they're doing too much cardiovascular work, or they're not eating appropriately for their training, or they're doing fasted training, the body perceives it as a threat. And so it starts to downturn your resting metabolic rate, downturn your thyroid, and interfere with your luteinizing hormone pulse. So women have a pulse of luteinizing hormone every day, and it builds up to right before ovulation when you have a surge. And if you're in a low energy state, the body is going to shut down reproductive function because it's like you don't have enough energy coming in to support what you're doing and maintain general health. You're definitely not going to have enough energy to support a full pregnancy. So it's interesting seeing the overlay of
Wow.
inflammatory responses and catabolic state that we see in a lot of female athletes, recreational and professional, both in resistance training and especially in endurance. And when you're driving that systematic inflammation and it comes after exercise and you're not eating enough, then you have this increase in inflammation, which causes a cascade of issues with regards to adaptation and recovery. So your cortisol stays elevated and you stay in this catabolic state. Again, your hypothalamus reads it and goes, hey, wait a second, there's not enough nutrition coming in. So kisspeptin is down regulated, and when kisspeptin is down regulated, you get that luteinizing hormone flatline, no ovulation, ceasing of menstrual cycle, or a lot of anovulatory cycles. So there is definitely an interesting link that hasn't really been pulled together. We just see what's happening in like the low energy red S literature. We see what's happening in the fertility literature, but there hasn't been someone to bring them together. Whereas when you're looking from the outside, you're like, of course, it makes sense. We just need an RCT to actually show what happens. Anecdotally, I've had a lot of women who've come to me and they've been trying to get pregnant, and they are in such a low energy state that they're having irregularity in their menstrual cycle, or they're having anovulatory cycles and they can't get pregnant. And I'm like, okay, well, let's fuel for what you were doing and make sure you're eating enough and eating enough protein. And then, like a few months down the line, I'll get an email, I'm pregnant. And it's like, see, your body just needs that fuel. And we have this systemic idea that women should not eat, right? We have this, oh, you shouldn't eat so much. If you want to lose weight, it's you reduce your calories, and then we have all these fad diets, and it's always the push to make women smaller. And I'm like, no, it's not about being smaller. Take up that space, take up that room, and eat, because you want your adaptations. You want to train hard, but you also need the fuel to adapt to it so that your hard training gives you benefits and doesn't jeopardize your health.
So then when you are in that low luteinizing hormone stage, you can reverse that with proper nutrition and fueling properly.
Absolutely.
Fueling properly.
Absolutely.
Okay. And that brings me to my next question, because I'm an ex-triathlete. Okay. So I learnt from, I was at training 7 days a week at 6 a.m. and this was for over 10 years. And I learned to get up and go straight to training. So I'm naturally training on an empty stomach. It would be very hard, which you're probably going to tell me, terrible, Louisa. It's just something that is embedded deep inside me from my teens and 20s, which is hard to shake in my 30s. So am I doing myself a detriment? Because I know you speak a lot about cortisol and in the morning as well. So let's talk about the best way for a female, doesn't matter what age we are,
Right.
What's the best way to train?
We know from good research that's been done that women do better in a fed state. So what I mean by that is, you have some protein and carbohydrate before training, so that you're boosting blood glucose levels, you're signaling to the hypothalamus there's nutrition there. And the reason for that is we fuel differently than men when we are training. So women go through blood glucose first, and then they start tapping into fatty acids. whereas men will go through a little bit of blood glucose, tap into muscle and liver glycogen, and then fatty acids. So if we start a training session with low blood glucose and elevated cortisol, it slows our body's ability to get into a proper fueling state. And in order to get into any kind of intensity or any kinds of like sustained threshold work that requires a little bit more of blood glucose, we have to have increased adrenaline, we have to have increased cortisol so that we can tap into our fueling state faster. So if we're looking at how are we optimizing our training and adaptation and health, we need to have some fuel before any kind of training. And I come from the same, like, years and years of waking up, getting out of bed and going, right? But it now is, I'm going to have a protein fortified coffee. So I have almond milk, some protein powder, an espresso, cold brew out the door. So I have something. Doesn't take
Oh,
a
okay.
lot,
So it's not
right?
an actual meal that you're not going and ingesting oats and bananas.
No.
Okay.
A lot of people think that that's what I mean. And there are
Yeah.
some women like, oh, I just can't eat. And then there are a lot of women like, I can't even eat until like noon. It's like, okay, well, it's not about the volume of food, it's about the quality of the protein and carbohydrate to support what you are doing. Because exercise in itself is a stress. So just the same as you wouldn't try to drive your petrol fueled car on E and then try to make it a race car on E, you can't do that with a female body. And primarily has to do with the hypothalamus. And we know that there are two areas in the brain of kisspeptin neurons. And that's just for women. But for men, there's one. And the reason for that is because women have an endocrine system that requires luteinizing hormone pulsation of estrogen, ovulation, and it's very sensitive to nutrition availability and nutrition density. So if we do fasted training and the brain is like, hey, wait a second, what's going on? There's not enough fuel here to do everything. Kisspeptin starts to downturn, which then leads to thyroid being downturned, luteinizing hormone pulse being pushed down and flatlined. And when we look at it as like pure numbers, the baseline intake for women to maintain endocrine health, and this is based on sedentary women, baseline intake for sedentary women to maintain endocrine health in a stressful environment, which is what we are in a global environment now, is 40 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. When we look at men, it's 15.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's a huge threshold difference for
Yeah,
that endocrine
huge.
dysfunction. So when we look at female athletes, they try to push it up to 45, and it's a big ask. But if we maintain at least that 40 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, then it just puts women on that baseline edge of being able to adapt and maintain a healthy endocrine system. And we know that the appetite and food intake is very dynamic depending on what you do in the day. And if you've had a really long, hard day, if you remember brick days from triathlon days and you're not
Oh, God.
hungry, and then the day after you're like ravenous going, what's going on? A lot of women don't eat to that. So they're always in a calorie deficit, and that tends to add up. And the other aspect is women will not be hungry and then they'll book in their calories at the end of the day, and they might be getting enough calories that they think from resting metabolic rate and activity levels, but it's the wrong time because women really need to look on that nutrient timing to support endocrine health. So say we get up and we do a swim squad, and then we might have a protein shake, and then we go through our day, and then we might have another session late afternoon. But we haven't really eaten that much in the day, and then we get home and we have time and we like eat a big meal and try to recover, have our nighttime snack, all the things that we've been told to do. But because we've had a big hole in the middle of the day and our body has stayed in that catabolic breakdown state, it perceives us as being in a low energy state. So women need to pay attention to eating a little bit before and recovering from that training session. Even if it's just that one training session a day, that's what you need to do. And then the rest of it you can play around with if you're trying to manipulate nutrition intake. But it's so critical for women to really fuel for what they are doing and recover from it in order to maintain that nutrition density and appetite control from the hypothalamus point of view.
Yeah, I think what I've been doing wrong, or what a lot of people are, we're listening to so many podcasts, and that's all based on, if we want to increase longevity or health span, then we need to have long periods of fasting. I know Peter Attia is very attuned to this method, and when you listen to it, it does have plausibility. But now I'm thinking, hey Peter, is your research done with
I'm in.
women, and does that? Yeah. It's just done on men, and now that's quite scary. So then, okay, what
And when
about
we look
then?
at it, though, like when we look at all the time restricted eating literature, there is some done on women, but it's been done on sedentary and or obese women. And when we look at exercise, exercise is a fasted state to begin with. So when you're looking at the longevity literature and all the things that happens with exercise and adaptation, you're getting that increased telomere length, you're getting the autophagy, you're getting the parasympathetic responses. And it is because your body is then adapting to exercise. But it has to be fueled exercise. Otherwise, your body stays in this breakdown state. And that's where that misstep is, where people are like, oh, I'm training so hard, but I'm not getting all these longevity aspects. It's because they are not fueling for it. And we know that when we have time restricted eating versus calorie restriction, in women, it does better to do a slight calorie restriction late in the evening away from any kind of training for body composition change and health. For men, time restricted eating tends to be better, and fasted training for men tends to be better because of these differences in the hypothalamus and differences in the way that we fuel for exercise. Because men default to blood glucose and default to carbohydrate. Their body has to be taught how to increase fatty acid metabolism. But by the nature of being born XX, we have increased proteins in the muscle mitochondria that make us use more fatty acids. We also have estrogen that increases our fatty acid use. We have estrogen, progesterone that come up in the luteal phase that pull carbohydrate into the endometrial lining, which encourages fatty acid use. So we don't need to be doing the fasted training for those kinds of benefits. And we don't need to be doing the time restricted eating for those benefits either, because fueled exercise is a much better, stronger stress for longevity for women as compared to intermittent fasting and time restricted eating.
Okay, so I've definitely been doing that wrong. I've been doing um, I don't usually eat until about midday, and then it's like I'm backloading before I go to bed because I'm just that hungry. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna switch that up. But my biggest struggle is, it's of course the weights room. I'm not afraid of it. I go in there and I do weights. I just don't feel like I'm changing. Like I look at my body and I'm like, it must be. It's not the lack of intensity. Maybe it's the number of sets I'm doing, number of exercises per muscle group. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So this is where we fall into women are always being pushed into doing like 3 or 4 sets of 10 to 12 reps. And that is more of a cardiovascular metabolic stimulus. It's not a power rip the muscle stimulus for strength. And we know that women are more endurant. And so, by that nature, we need to do more power training to get the results of like tone and increased lean mass without being bulky. So, we go by the 3 to 5 rule: 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 minutes recovery between. And that's what you do. And it's
Sorry, I
three
just
to,
want to cut in there. It's
yeah.
so funny that you said that, because I brought on Dr. Andy Galpin,
Yeah.
and he actually said the exact same thing. And I said, Andy, what should we be trying? He goes, it's the 3 to 5 rule, Louisa. 3 to 5. And you just exactly, wow.
Yeah.
That's been now a man and a woman, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I'm going to be doing this 3 to 5 from
Yep.
now on.
And
Okay.
the thing about it is when you're doing weights properly, it is very intense from a muscle recruitment standpoint, but it's not really intense from a metabolic cardiovascular standpoint. So I'll see women who are trying to lift heavy, but they're not having enough recovery between their sets So their heart rate stays elevated, and then they quit before they get to the point of failure because it's a metabolic load, a cardiovascular load, instead of a muscle load. So that's why that recovery between is so important. And when you see women who are transferring from a long time endurance cardiovascular background into the weight room, they're not sitting around waiting. They're like, I'm in and out, I'm in and out. It's like when you see people who are Olympic lifters or have come from a resistance training background, they'll do a heavy set and then they'll sit around for like 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes before they do the next one. Because they want full recovery. They want full central nervous system recovery in order then to go back in, recruit as many fibers as possible to lift that heavy load. And that is what you're after.
So there is a difference between 3 and 5. If I do 3 sets or if I do 5 sets, there is a difference. So why is it 3 to 5? Why isn't it just 4 reps, 4 sets? Like,
I know. So when we look at it, it's like when you start out with a heavy load, most likely you're only going to be able to do 3 reps. But as you become stronger, before you build up again, you're going to be closing in on that 5 rep. When you get to that 5 rep, you know that you definitely, if you can do 3 sets of 5 relatively easy, then you're not going heavy enough. So that's what the 5 comes from.
that's looking at what, a 70 or 80% one
Yeah.
repetition max? Okay.
Yeah.
70?
Start at 70, you can go up to 90.
Start at 70.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, I wish I could do. Can we do a training session together? That would that'll
That'd be
probably
fun.
tear me to pieces. Okay, so we've touched on lightly on nutrition, but we're going to go into it deeper because one of the biggest differences between you and I is you are a vegan, I am not. So is that's by choice or is that by science
Choice.
or both? Okay.
Choice for me. Because back when I was in high school, we took a field trip to a pig slaughterhouse. And that,
Oh wow.
being in San Francisco and driving up and down the 5 to LA, you smell the feedlots. And just the way that the US grows their food and treats the animals was when I turned way back when I was a teenager. But over the years of being an elite athlete, there were times when I wished I could eat animal protein because it's just a high quality of protein with really good leucine. And now there is many vegan options that have that same availability. But back when I was going through all of this, there wasn't. So it was really difficult. It's like I got into a conversation with a woman yesterday who is very much carnivore-ish. And we all say the same thing. It's not about plant-based or animal-based. It's about getting that quality of protein from your own choice, what you choose to do. And it's the nutrition density. So we leave the cultural aspects out because there are many things you can go about, like environmental considerations and animal efficacy and all of those things that get wrapped up in the conversation. So if we remove that from the conversation, we're looking purely at nutrition density. It's what is best for your body and what do you like. So if you thrive on plant-based and you get adequate protein, you get adequate leucine, and you're seeing adaptations, sweet. But if you're someone who is animal-based and you want that and you like that and it works for you, sweet. Just both of them need to make sure that they have adequate fibrous food for gut microbiome. But the issue with plant-based is they often end up being too full before they get the proper nutrition density. So it's really important to put that protein aspect first, especially if you're an active woman. And what is that protein? That is up to you. And then taking care of that gut microbiome as well, because those two things are so critical for women.
I'm so happy you said that because I don't prescribe to the plant-based. I don't prescribe to the carnivore. I eat meat, I eat dairy, I eat plants, and I'm really happy that you've actually stated that when it comes to building muscle for women and health for women, you're not saying stay away from red meat or only eat organ meat. I'm really happy that you said that.
No.
So and then when you're thinking about it, you mentioned leucine. And is that the biggest driver of protein synthesis?
It is, but we also know that we need the other essential amino acids with it. So it used to be where you're just looking at branched chain amino acids
Yeah.
and leucine is the driver, and you just get enough leucine. People are taking leucine powder, but you need the other essential amino acids for everything to work. But leucine is the driver from a brain and muscle standpoint to increase and perpetuate muscle protein synthesis. But the feedback mechanisms within it also use the other amino acids to signal. So leucine, yes, definitely the main driver, but you need the other essential amino acids around it to make it actually work well.
There was a period in my life where I focused on macros. Have you ever done that? Do you hate women who do that?
I'm I used to be one of the people who was like, yeah, calories, macros really important. But now I find it really off putting for a lot of women because they become so focused on how many grams of this and that. And it's very nutrient science oriented. It's not nutrition. Because you could get 120 grams of protein from protein powder, but that is not the same as 120 grams of protein from real food sources. Because real food has other cofactors in it that help things work well in our body, as well as take care of other systems rather than just muscle protein synthesis. So when we're looking at what is the nutrition density, that's what it's about. It's not about how many grams of this and how many grams of that. And women can get really, really focused on macro, 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 and lose sight of what it means to be nourished versus what it means to have calories.
Yeah, that's yeah. I became really obsessed with the app, My Fitness Pal, and I had a little scale, and I was literally I was not like 1 calorie off the mark, and it wasn't a good place to live because it was like, well, I can't have a glass of wine, I can't have this, I can't have that. You become really, but look, I got really thin, so
Yeah. But were you healthy?
exactly. That was back in the early 20s. Okay. So right now you're focusing a lot on in your day to day in your business, you're focusing a lot on menopausal women, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is that?
I think primarily because her book came out, but um, the first book came out and we had a chapter on menopausal women, and that became the biggest question because there's this huge amount of active women who want to maintain activity levels. They want to be competitive. They want to improve body composition, but there was nothing out there that was able to direct peri and postmenopausal women in the right way to maintain their lifestyle. So when Roar came out and we had this one chapter, there was suddenly a flurry of questions coming in. How? Help, 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 help. What's going on? What's going on? So started really digging, and my postdoc at Stanford was with the Women's Health Initiative, and then I rolled into still working in that space with one hand in human performance and one hand in public health, specifically in the peri and postmenopausal set. And it became just kind of second nature, knowing what was happening, what was going on with the hormones, what kind of exercise to do, what kind of adaptogens to use. And when I had these answers and realized they weren't general knowledge, it's like, we got to get this out there because we see this big push for using HRT or menopause hormone therapy. And we see this big push that, once you hit menopause, you're doomed to put on all this weight and you age out of being competitive. And that's all a cultural misnomer. So, as a
Wow.
physiologist, trying to explain to people what's going on and then what kind of external stress we can add to the body to support the body how the hormones used to be is what I think has taken off so much, especially like with the new book and, Celine's Hit Play, Not Pause. It's the explanation because it's never been there before. There might be a medical doctor who comes in and says, these are the changes to expect, and this is the medication you can do, or you need to exercise, but no one's explaining exactly the nuances of what kind of exercise, what kind of food. No, you don't have to go on menopause hormone therapy. There are alternatives unless it's really, really, really difficult to get through the day, and then it's a therapy. It's not a replacement. So there's a whole bunch of information that I held that now I pushed out, and it's been really interesting to see how many women are like, oh my gosh, I finally have answers and I'm changing things and I'm seeing results. And but it's been a hard push.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because at med school it was literally just, okay, perimenopause, this is what to prescribe during menopause. It was literally just pharmacological. So you're coming in with the education, and I think that's the way out, especially even when it comes to brain health. As we mentioned several times, you and I together, we've had chats about what happens to the brain during menopause, and it's all about just education and putting it out there. So let's just stick to that. Can you take me through the life cycle of a woman and what happens in her body and what to expect during perimenopause and postmenopause, or a menopausal woman? What's happening?
Yeah, so menopause itself is just one day on the calendar. And a lot of people don't realize that menopause just means 12 months, no periods. You can say it's your birthday the rest of your life. The time period before that is perimenopause. The time period after that is postmenopause. All the body composition changes that we see and associate with menopause happen in perimenopause, not postmenopause. Perimenopause can be around 10 years before that one point in time. And
Wow.
we start to see it in the early to mid 40s for most women, where all of a sudden the training and nutrition that they were previously doing isn't working for them. Even could be like 6 or 7 months prior to, things are working and now all of a sudden they're not. And they're starting to put on body fat, they're starting to lose lean mass, their sleep's a little bit disrupted. And so unfortunately the automatic answer is train more, eat less, which doesn't help. What's happening is now they're starting to have more and more anovulatory cycles. So if you're not ovulating, you won't have as much progesterone, if at all. So you have a very much imbalanced ratio of estrogen progesterone. So it's a different ratio than what your body's used to.
So they're starting to not get their period.
No, you can still have your period.
Okay.
Because you'll have some withdrawal from estrogen. And this is the thing. Women will say, oh, my cycle's regular. What's going on? But we look at the bleed pattern. So if the bleed pattern changes, it goes from really heavy to super light, or you go from something like 5 or 7 days to 2 days, that is a definitive sign that you're perimenopausal, because you're starting to have significant changes to your bleed pattern. The length of your cycle might stay the same. It's that bleed pattern we're worried about. So when we start seeing some irregularities in bleed patterning and changes in the body that you're like, hey, I don't understand what's going on, we know that this is perimenopause. And we see that the biggest difference in our body composition happens at 4 or 5 years before menopause. This is where we see a significant decrease in lean mass, increase in fat mass, decrease in bone mineral density, unless we do something to attenuate it. So when we look, what does estrogen progesterone do? They're responsible for blood glucose control, for bone mineral density, for muscle mass and muscle protein synthesis. So we need to look at changing our training and our nutrition, like I said, to create a stress that makes the body adapt how these hormones used to allow the body to adapt. So when we look at things like estrogen and muscle protein synthesis, estrogen is specifically tied to the myosin protein filament of actin myosin that come together for contraction. So if we don't have estrogen, or we have low estrogen, we have less of a integral part of myosin. So it's not as good. So what we need to do is that heavy strength training that you and I were just talking about. Because with heavy strength training, it's a neuromuscular stimulus. So the nerve comes in and says, I need to recruit more fibers and have very strong contraction to overcome this load. So if you have that, then the myosin has to work. The myosin gets a signal to work. So that's that alternative stress that allows the muscle to maintain its integrity and also get the signaling to keep going, to keep regenerating, and to increase lean mass development. If we look at progesterone, and progesterone is really integral in like blood sugar control. And as women get into perimenopause, we get more and more insulin resistance. So we need to look at how are we going to create an environment that increases our ability to intake carbohydrate and pull it into the liver and the muscle where it needs to be without insulin. So we look at high intensity work. We look at plyometric work. We look at sprint interval training, because these stresses are so high that they cause an epigenetic change within the muscle where we have more of a GLUT4 protein that opens up and pulls carbohydrate in without insulin. So there are these things that we do with training, and again, fueling for what we are doing and recovering from it, especially with protein. Because when we look at how estrogen, progesterone used to just kind of float around and allow our heart and our muscles and everything to work well, if we're supplying a different stress and supporting that stress, then we can keep continuing to improve our body composition and keep achieving our performance potential. So that 150 minutes of moderate activity that's so prescribed is bullshit for women, especially at this phase of life.
So my question is, for me, sometimes when I'm having a stressful month with work, whatever, travel, I may only get my period for 2 or 3 days. Then there'll be a month where it's like, okay, then it's a full, 4 to 5 days. So what is the why is that? You just mentioned bleed pattern and perimenopause, and it's like, well, how do I know what I am? And by the way, I'm 34.
Yeah, you're a bit too early.
A bit too early, I understand. But that's a different thing, right? That's a
stress related thing. Because I'll look at our athletes, our team athletes, who are traveling because New Zealand's so small and they have to travel internationally, right? So I can tell when they're traveling and when they're at home from their bleed patterns and when their period is, because it'll lengthen or they'll have a longer cycle when they're traveling because of the stress. And again, stress creates inflammation. It creates an increased baseline of cortisol, and it signals the body, I'm in a breakdown state. So you're going to have a flattening of that luteinizing hormone pulse. So you probably won't be ovulating when you're under high stress. And then when you get home and you're in your own environment and you can sleep properly, you can eat how you normally eat, you can train how you normally eat, your body kind of relaxes and it's like, sweet, everything's good. So then you fall back into your normal pattern. With perimenopause, though, it can change month to month, even if you're not traveling. We also know that there's an increase in baseline cortisol because there's an increase in sympathetic drive in perimenopause. So in conjunction with changes in bleed pattern, we have to look at body composition changes. We have to look at what's happening with the training, because there's so many women who are like, I got squishy overnight, it seems. What happened? It's like, this is what's happening. We need to change it up so that your body will respond to those stressors as if those hormones were there.
And then women who then go into menopause, I believe I heard you say once that there is a window of opportunity to have HRT, hormone replacement therapy. And you mentioned also that you don't have to do that. You don't have to go on these, yeah.
Right. So we look at menopause hormone therapy. It is a therapy. And there are some women who have such severe symptoms in the menopause transition, perimenopause, and early postmenopause, that they can't function. They can't get out of bed. They're having vasomotor symptoms all the time, severe anxiety, significant body composition changes, and no matter what they do, they can't get on top of it. And this is where hormone therapy can definitely help. Now, the thing about hormone therapy is it's not a full replacement for your natural hormones, because the other thing that's happening in perimenopause is we are losing estrogen receptors because we don't have as much estrogen. So the receptors are kind of like, I need to downgrade sensitivity. So we have a change in our estrogen receptors. We have a change in our progesterone receptors, so that when you are taking in these synthetics, you're still not getting the same effect because you don't have as many receptors to be activated by that. So we see that it doesn't help change body composition. It slows the rate of change. You still have to do the right training and nutrition to maximize positive body composition change. When we look at bone density, we know that synthetic hormones don't help with bone mineral density. It just slows the rate of loss. So with the therapy, it slows the rate of the negative aspects of going through perimenopause and helps attenuate those really severe symptoms. But you have to do something from a training and nutrition standpoint for longevity to actually improve your body composition, improve your performance potential. and get into good habits to decrease that tired but wired sympathetic state. So this is, I think, the big misnomer, because I know in the UK there's this big push to call it, menopause is female hormone deficiency syndrome. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not. It's a natural process of aging. Every woman from every culture, from every country goes through this. So it's not a rebranding, it's a natural process of aging. It's just that women don't age in a linear fashion like men do. We have a definitive point that's called peri-postmenopause. And if it was a male issue, it'd be solved by now. And we would have been talking about it a long time ago. But it's
We'd
not.
have a lot of funding for it.
Right. It's a female thing. And so when we look at the cultural aspects of what's going on, there's the rebranding to be able to have a pharmaceutical push to, quote, save women from having to go through this aging process. But it's not. It's not a saving women. It's not a replacing hormones that your body naturally produces. It's an artificial stimulus of a hormone profile that's not sustainable. So we look at it as a therapy. We look at it as a way to complement what you're doing from a lifestyle behavior change, to improve what you're doing, to get you through this transition, to then get you into postmenopause for a better quality of life.
Wow. This is, I mean, you need to go on Joe Rogan and say this.
I know.
Okay?
We should go together.
We should definitely go together. But in saying that, you're now doing a lot of, I call it public education. You're a PhD, and it's you're putting a lot of public education out there in the form of both a course. You've got your books. Has the new book, is it out there yet?
Yep. It launched on the 17th, but I need your mailing address so I can send you one. Because I've got a whole box right over here.
Okay, I need you to send that today.
Yes.
But you've also got a course. So talk to us about some of the things that you've got going on. I know you've got mini courses and you've got big courses where you've only got a few cohorts per year that goes into it, correct?
Yep. So we have two big courses. One is The Women Are Not Small Men, which is 7 to 8 weeks of worth of material. And it is the deep dive of women across the lifespan, from puberty all the way through to postmenopause, about what happens, what changes, what kind of nutrition you should be doing, what kind of training you should be doing, understanding hormone flux, menstrual cycle, phase-based training, oral contraceptive pill, IUD, all of that kind of stuff, all the questions. And then the second big course we have is a little bit smaller, and it's all about peri and postmenopause. So it's technically menopause for athletes, knowing that anybody who exercises on purpose is an athlete. And then we have several small, what are called micro-learning courses. So they're about an hour long, and it's a deep dive into things like protein and protein supplementation, how to read the label, how do I know I'm getting what I need, why do I need it, collagen, iron deficiency, what else are we doing? Menstrual cycle, phase-based training, low energy availability, using environmental stressors for health and performance, so like heat and cold. It's a lot of the questions that I get, and so we've just done a small deep dive course so people who have that particular question can go in and get it answered.
Damn. And we're going to link all of those courses. We're going to link your wonderful Instagram page to this as well. Where else do you hang out? Oh, and you've got a podcast. I was featured on it a month ago, I think. So we're going to link that too. One final question for you. And if people are going to be watching this on YouTube, you can see this. How do I get rid of this? Like, just tell me. Just plain and simple.
That's
it's just
normal.
this. It sits there. It upsets me. How do I get rid of it? I'm pointing,
has
guys, to the, I'm pointing, no, you don't have it. I'm pointing to my bicep fat that just sits there. That wasn't there in my 20s and when I was a swimmer.
Women put fat on back here and in their stomach and in their thighs. So it's easy to mobilize. It's doing the power-based training. So you're going to do your 3 to 5s, right?
3 to 5s.
And that will definitely mobilize it. Because the other really cool bit of research that's come out in the past month is that women who resistance train mobilize all these fatty deposits that cardiovascular work does not.
Damn. Hit that weights room, ladies. Dr. Stacy Sims, thank you so much for being part of the Neuro Experience podcast.
Thanks for having me. Fun.